Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to Rockford University. It's very nice to have you all here. It's nice to see students, community members, faculty, staff, trustees, sponsors, all of you. You're very welcome. Well, I'm Eric Folcomer. I'm the president of Rockford University. On behalf of all of us, faculty, staff, students, alumni, and friends of the university, it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight for this very special event. This is put on by the Institute for Public Policy and World Affairs at Rockford University, and we have a number of co-hosts this evening: the Rockford Chamber of Commerce, the Rockford Public Library, and the Atlantic Council Speakers Bureau. So I want to thank them for co-hosting tonight's event. The sponsors are on the screen, and Congressman Manzullo will talk about that when he gets up here next. The Institute is a newer initiative for Rockford University. It was founded in 2019 by former Congressman Don Manzullo and Dr. Catherine Forsland. Catherine is the Isabel Ross Abbott Professor of History and Women's Studies at Rockford University. The Institute is a nonpartisan and independent organization dedicated to bringing the world to the Rockford region to help promote and advance global engagement and understanding. By utilizing experts, scholars, and leaders in the humanities, the sciences, business, government, and other disciplines, it presents programs that enrich the public and its knowledge of the larger world. It aims to broaden and expand the impact of the university locally, nationally, and internationally, providing insight and solutions in wide-ranging policy areas that affect global affairs and humanity generally. This is the 6th program by the Institute and the first one to be live streamed. It will also be recorded and later posted on a future Institute website, hopefully very soon. On behalf of the Institute, its partners and sponsors for tonight's event, we appreciate very much your being here and supporting our work to make the world a better place through the exchange of ideas and a well-informed citizenry. I had a chance to meet the panelists before this event, and I can tell you we're in for quite a fantastic program. Let me introduce to you Congressman Manzullo. The Honorable Donald Manzullo is a Rockford native and was a member of Congress from 1993 to 2013, representing the district that includes Rockford University. While there, he served on the committees on international relations, financial services, and small business, where he was chairman from 2001 to 2007. Following his retirement from Congress, Congressman Manzullo served as the CEO of the Korea Economic Institute of America from 2013 to 2018. This public policy think tank institute deals with international trade, socio-political and economic issues of Asia, and Asian trade relations with the U.S. and other countries. As Associate Director of the Institute, Mr. Manzullo brings unique experience in international trade and financing with emphasis on manufacturing to our examination of public and global policy and issues. He participated in U.S.-Mexico, U.S.-EU, and U.S.-Japan-Korea interparliamentary exchanges and chaired those with China and Canada. He also chaired the Asia Subcommittee on Foreign Affairs. Congressman Manzullo will moderate our panel this evening, but first will introduce us to some impressive local high school students, hopefully future Rockford University students, who will in turn introduce our panelists. So as Congressman Manzullo comes up, I just want to note that we do have refreshments in the back. If you get thirsty during the event or hungry, feel free to go get some, and then of course we hope you'll stay afterward and talk with our panelists and others and enjoy some refreshments. So with that, I'll turn it over to Congressman Manzullo. You want this in here? You want to hold it?
Thank you, Eric. This is a really exciting evening tonight. There are several pads and pens that are being circulated. If you would like to come to another program, please print, P-R-I-N-T, your name and your email, and we'll make sure that you get on our email list. We're thankful to the Rockford Public Library system and the Chamber for helping us to co-sponsor tonight's events. And we're also thankful to the sponsors. Bergstrom, Inc., Woodward, Inc., Ringland Johnson Construction, Backroad Auto Malls, Savant Wealth Management, Morrissey Family Businesses, Chartwell Agency, Hinshaw and Culbertson Attorneys, Blackhawk Bank, Illinois Bank and Trust, Stillman Bank, Caney Aerospace, and Klinkenbeard Manufacturing. Let's give these sponsors a big hand. Catherine Forsland is the director, and I'm the assistant director of the Institute. Catherine, could you please stand and wave so people can... There she is. Thank you. The Institute on Public Policy and World Affairs at RU was started in 2019 by my post-Congress desire to continue serving the community and, frankly, looking for something to do and stay out of Frida's hair. Professor Forsland's vision for sharing her talent with the greater Rockford community is the Isabel Ross Abbott Professor of History and Women's Studies and Chair of the Historical and International Studies Department at Rockford University. And here she teaches U.S. diplomatic, women's, and modern Chinese history. We see Rockford University as one of the outstanding liberal arts colleges and universities and a beacon of learning and knowledge, not only to the students, but to the local community and to the people across the nation who are participating by live streaming. The Institute has presented programs including on immigration, constitutional rights in a time of pandemic, international trade and sanctions, returning civility to America, featuring former members of Congress, ambassadors, and authors and scholars from around the country. In the spring, we look forward to a program on challenges to local news reporting, radio, TV, and newsprint. Dr. Forsland brings her academic and interesting background to RU. She has a BA from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, with an MA and PhD in diplomatic history from Washington University in St. Louis. Her publications include Anna Chenault, Informal Diplomacy and Asian Relations, published in 2002, Off for the Ditch, Theodore and Edith Roosevelt's Visit Panama in 1906, published in 2010 in the Journal of White House History, in addition to articles on editorial cartoons of the Korean War era. For over 25 years, she's presented academic conferences and public venues dealing with world affairs. She also co-authored with two other RU faculty, We Are a College at War, Women Working for Victory in World War II, published in 2010. This book details the various women's roles during World War II, as exemplified by the all-female student body and mostly female faculty and staff at RU, then Rockford College, during World War II, including their efforts to support the troops through volunteerism, enlistment, and political action. And her mom is a graduate of this school in the class of 1946. And while I'm plugging books, I just published my memoir, Do Nice Guys Run for Congress? How an Obscure Country Lawyer Kept His Faith, Beat the Establishment, and Survived 20 Years in Congress. And so, Dr. Forsland, thank you for your dedication to Rockford University. We're blessed this evening to include 3 high schools. We want to bring the high school community into closer contact with RU, not only to advertise the great liberal arts college here at RU, but let them know of the learning that this institution is offering. So Molly Ryan is the senior at Boylan. She's on the varsity swim team. Just came in from practice and your hair is dry, okay. She's the president of the Key Club. She desires to study neuroscience, and she will introduce Ambassador John Herbst. And then, Ambassador, when you are introduced, if you could go up and take a seat up there. Molly?
Good evening. I would once again like to thank the event hosts and sponsors for organizing this important town hall event.
You're taller than I am. So
that good?
However it works. You might just want to.
All right.
Okay.
As a young person, I can't think of anything of greater importance than to hear and learn from experts about the myriad of destabilizing impacts that have resulted from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I am honored to have been asked to introduce our next speaker, who has spent his entire career serving this country in the cause of peace and stability. Ambassador John Herbst is the Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. He served for 31 years as a Foreign Service Officer in the U.S. Department of State. He was U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine from 2003 to 2006, where he worked to enhance U.S.-Ukrainian relations. In his last 4 years in the State Department, he served as Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization, leading the U.S. government's civilian capacity in societies in transition from conflict or civil strife, and to provide support to countries at risk of instability. Ambassador Herbst oversaw the establishment of the Civilian Response Corps of the United States and also served at the U.S. embassies in Tel Aviv, Moscow, and Saudi Arabia. He most recently served as Director for Complex Operations at the National Defense University. For his impactful service, he has received the Presidential Distinguished Service Award, the Secretary of State's Career Achievement Award, and the State's Department's Distinguished Honor Award. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ambassador John Herbst.
Nagbuk Hanyak is a senior at Keith School, active in student government, Model UN, and aspires to study computer science. Will introduce Ambassador Andras Simone.
Good evening. My name is Nang Bakonyak, and I am a senior at Keith Country Day School in Rockford. I am honored tonight to introduce Ambassador Andras Simone. Andras Simone is a former Hungarian ambassador to the United States, now living and working in Washington, D.C. Ambassador Simone was the managing director for the Center for Transatlantic Relations at the School for Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University from 2012 to 2018. And he is presently working with the George Washington University School of Engineering and Applied Science. Prior to moving to the United States, Ambassador Simone was, from 2002 to 2007, Hungary's ambassador to the United States. He was the first Hungarian ambassador to NATO, becoming the first permanent representative of Hungary after the country joined the alliance. His prior assignments included Deputy Chief of Mission of Hungary to the European Union, later the European Commission. Ambassador Simone is a trained transportation economist with a PhD in international affairs. In his academic work, he specializes in transatlantic relations, transatlantic energy, and the Nordic countries. He publishes frequently in The Hill, The Huffington Post, and other media outlets. Ambassador Simone is also an accomplished rock guitarist and bass player. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Andras Simone to Rockford University.
Cadet Command Sergeant Major Eric Larson is a junior at Auburn High School, my alma mater. He is in the Service Academy. He's been a part of the Auburn Knights JROTC BN for 3 years. He is on the Raider, Marksmanship, Color Guard, Drumline, and Archery team. And upon graduation, he will enlist as part of the active Army. He will introduce Captain William Ostendorf. Eric, where are you? There you are.
Thank you, and good evening. I will be introducing Captain William Ostendorf, Commissioner of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, NRC, former Director of the Committee on Science, Engineering and Public Policy, and Director of the Board on Global on global science and technology at the National Academies, former Principal Deputy Administrator at National Nuclear Security Administration, staff members of the House Armed Services Committee, as Counsel and Staff Director of Strategic Forces Submarine with oversight responsibility for the Department of Energy's atomic energy defense activities, as well as the Department of Defense Space, Missile Defense, and Intelligence. Retired as Captain in the Navy, U.S. Naval Academy graduate, professor at USNA, teaching courses in national security, nuclear weapons policy, Congress and national security, law and national security, director of USNA, Division of Mathematics and Science, expert on nuclear power, warfare, strategy, and threats. Without further ado, Captain Ostendorf.
We're going to have each of our esteemed speakers speak for about 15 to 20 minutes. We want to leave plenty of time for questions coming in. Let's start first with Ambassador Herbst, and then Ambassador Simony, and then Captain Ostender. Ambassador, do you have?
I do. Good evening. Okay. I'm going to talk about American interests in dealing with the problem of a very aggressive Kremlin. And the focus of that problem is Putin's war on Ukraine, which has been going on for now over 8.5 years. And Putin's latest move in this war has been the large conventional invasion of Ukraine that began in February. But I want to go back a little bit so you understand the stakes. The United States has a vital is international relations talk, for extremely important interest in ensuring that Putin loses his war in Ukraine. Now, why do I say that? As you know, Russia is the only peer nuclear power with the United States. They have a large nuclear arsenal, and it's roughly comparable to ours, although they have a vastly inferior conventional military and an economy which is basically a third world economy with lots of hydrocarbons, oil and gas, other minerals, and actually a not bad but not great defense industry. Putin's objective, his foreign policy objective, which he has said numerous times publicly, is to restore Moscow's control across the space of the former Soviet Union. That space includes 3 NATO states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, whom we are pledged to defend with American troops, with American lives. And Putin has also said that he wants to be able to dictate the defense arrangements of all the countries that were never part of the Soviet Union, but were part of the Soviet Empire, countries of the Warsaw Pact. And that's another 6 or 7 NATO allies of the United States, whom we are pledged to defend with American lives. Putin first needs to win his war on Ukraine. And this is a war not to keep Ukraine out of NATO, as many people have misinformed you. This is a war designed to assure Kremlin political control of the country. If Putin wins this war in Ukraine, we have to worry in a very serious way about Putin aggression against Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania, again, whom we are pledged to defend with American lives. What this means is that the smart move for the United States, the economical move for the United States, is to send all the support Ukraine needs to defeat Putin's troops in Ukraine. Anyone who tells you that America has no interest in Ukraine does not understand Russia, does not understand Putin, and does not understand America's vital interests. We have been extraordinarily lucky people, everyone in this room. There has been no period in history, literally not one period in history, where there has been the absence of wars between great powers. That ended with World War II. And largely thanks to American leadership, as exemplified in the NATO alliance, Europe, which was the place where 2 world wars started, has been peaceful. And despite all the messiness of the past 20 years in American foreign policy, and we've made many mistakes in the greater Middle East, despite all of that, there's been no great power war. And that's been assured by American strength, working with our partners, especially in NATO. And Putin's objective is to undermine NATO. And while it's tragic that we lost thousands of soldiers in our misadventures, our mistaken adventures in Iraq and Afghanistan, compare that to the, 400,000 military who died in World War II, the couple of 100,000 who died in World War I, and of course the 600,000 who died in our greatest war in terms of casualties, the Civil War, and it's very small. Because we weren't fighting major powers. And American strength is essential to this, and American alliances are essential to this. And along with this period of relative stability globally, again, despite all the wars that we read about every day in the papers, because of this, and because of extraordinary developments in technology globally, led by, but not just involving the United States, we have prosperity today that is unknown historically. In 1800, 99.9% of the world's population lived in absolute poverty. In 1950, after World War II, that number was over 70%. In 1990, that had dropped to roughly 30%. Today, it's under 10%. And of course, with all the economic problems we have in the United States, we live in extraordinary prosperity by any historical standard. And of course, we want to address the absence of prosperity among parts of our population, but we should not forget what we have and the reason we have it. And again, that's based first and foremost on an institution, the institutions and the international system, which have prevented great power war and promoted economic interchange. And for that, a strong NATO is absolutely essential. Now, Putin's aim is to take out NATO. And our, again, smart economical policy is to stop him in Ukraine. We can do that by providing substantial assistance. You know how much money the U.S. has poured into Ukraine this year. A large amount of money, as long as you don't compare it to the cost of a Putin war on the Baltic states, in which case that $60 million is gone in a month or two. We wasted $3 trillion on our misadventures in Iraq and Afghanistan. Misadventures, and I could talk about why, but I don't think we have time tonight. But anyone who compares our policy on Ukraine to our policy in Afghanistan and Iraq knows nothing about Ukraine. And the simple proof for all of you to see with your own eyes is the fact of how well the Ukrainian army is fighting against a much bigger force. We saw how the Afghan army collapsed even before we withdrew. And it's amazing how many Americans who say we have no interest in Ukraine never pick up on this point. They always make the analogy between Ukraine, where we have vital interest and where we can win by helping Ukraine, smartly economically, and our misadventures in the greater Middle East. No. Let's not exchange one stupid policy for another. They are busy fighting the last war, like some misbegotten generals. The last war meaning our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. When we have a new situation here where we have to remain strong. So, what's our policy? Our policy in this war is a sound one. It is big sanctions on Russia, which have been imposed, significant arms transfers to Ukraine, which has happened, and strengthening NATO's deployments in the East in the countries that are most vulnerable if Putin wins in Ukraine. While that overall policy is sound, and the amount of support we provided to Ukraine is sufficient, our overall policy, and this is my quibble, I'll use a polite word, with the Biden administration, is only adequate. It's not strong. Because while we're sending lots of weapons, and Ukraine desperately needs those weapons, we have been timid and slow in sending the more advanced weapons Ukraine needs, A, to prevent more Ukrainians from dying, and B, to win the war faster. And the administration has frankly been intimidated by Russian nuclear threats. Sadly, about 6 or 8 times going back to February, someone senior in the administration has said, we can't do X. For example, send MiGs to Ukraine. We can't do Y, send longer-range artillery to Ukraine. We can't do Z, send significant anti-ship or anti-aircraft missiles to Ukraine, because Putin might escalate and we might face Armageddon. That is a putz foreign policy. Not the foreign policy of a superpower that understands leadership. And not the foreign policy of a country which knows its own history. Putin's Russia is a danger, but much less of a danger to us than the Soviet Union. And several times we went toe-to-toe with the Soviets over Berlin and Cuba and did not blink and won. Now, thank God, and I mean that, thank God, I'm a believer. We haven't heard such weak language from the administration for 2 months. I think they finally got it. And Biden on 60 Minutes in the middle of September and at the UN a few days later, and more recently since, has said to Moscow, you use nukes and the consequences for you will be devastating. Exactly the right message. So we've got that straight. But we still continue to dawdle on sending Ukraine the more sophisticated weapons it needs. It took the administration, and by the way it works is like this. Ukraine asks for the weapons that they need to first defend themselves and then to take back their territory. And we say no, because we're timid. Then Ukraine has some smaller victories on the ground, or Russia commits some atrocity. Public sentiment in the United States is appalled by those atrocities. Congress is pushing the administration in the right direction. And then we say yes to some of the stuff we say no to. The big thing here was when we sent HIMARS, an artillery system. It's called shoot and scoot, which means you shoot with your HIMARS, and then they quickly move away so they can't be targeted. We sent them to Ukraine at the end, in the middle of June, end of June. We gave them, for the first time, a range of artillery which could hit 85 kilometers away, as opposed to the 40-kilometer range we arbitrarily set, because we didn't want to provoke Putin. As soon as those HIMARS arrived, the Russian offensive in the east of Ukraine stopped. And then Ukraine began its counteroffensive, which has been quite successful. But if we sent Ukraine all the other pieces of equipment that they've asked for, top-line tanks, top-line armored personnel carriers, we're starting to send MiGs yet. So that's one place we've changed. But we're not talking about getting them our F-16s, which we could. It would take some time, but we could begin the process of training them to get them F-16s, say, 6 or 8 or 10 months from now. We should be doing that. Sending them ATACMS, which is a missile which has a range of 300 kilometers. We keep saying no, 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 no. Eventually, we'll send some of that stuff, but we send it too slow to make the fast impact we need. And Prolonging the war works against our interests because there is an economic cost to this war. And also, there's some sentiment growing, especially among a wing of the Republican Party here, against the war because they're completely blind to our interests in this war. They speak of this subject without any real historical knowledge or understanding of our interests in foreign policy. All right. I think I've ticked off enough people already, but I want to finish with one more point, which I think Bill will also get into. And I touched on it a little bit, but I want to touch on it a little bit more. I would say the major argument we hear today against a stronger American policy, or for that matter, against the current American policy, which I consider adequate. Putin can't win as long as our support remains at this level, and ultimately he'll lose. And by the way, he'll lose because the Ukrainian people understand that their existence as Ukrainians depends upon victory. Russia's war on Ukraine has been unsuccessful against the Ukrainian military, so he is targeting Ukrainian civilians. He's targeting their residences. He's targeting infrastructure, especially electricity now. He wants to freeze them out this winter. And when Russia occupies parts of Ukraine, they torture every man in sight. They rape the women. The soldiers are encouraged to rape women. And they abduct Ukrainian children, send them to Russia to be raised as Russians. These are massive war crimes. Former president of Russia, Medvedev, says, our job, the Russian job in Ukraine, is to destroy Ukrainianness. So Russia's objective is not to keep Ukraine out of NATO, it's to ensure a docile population in Ukraine that they can control. And they're willing to commit massive war crimes to do it. And by the way, Putin loves the Russian Orthodox Church. He also treats with respect what he calls the traditional religions of Russia that include Judaism and Islam, but only if their leaders are subservient to the state. He doesn't like the non-traditional religions of Russia, Catholicism, Protestantism. And every place in Ukraine that he occupies, he goes after the evangelicals, the Baptists. This is not well understood here. But everyone who says we have no interest in Ukraine should say, okay, we're happy to let Russians commit war crimes in Ukraine, including going after our fellow evangelicals and Baptists and Catholics. The people who support ending Ukraine, the people who are against American aid to Ukraine don't want to talk about Russian war crimes and the destruction of evangelicals. You need to talk about that. Because when they tell you we need to tell Ukraine to make a peace, the peace they have in mind is giving parts of Ukraine to Putin. And sadly, that's not just giving Ukrainian turf, it's giving Ukrainians to be subject to these war crimes. So this is a policy which is anti-human rights, anti-Catholic, anti-Protestant, and of course, anti-family values. Kidnapping children, having them adopted by others when their parents are alive. This is guaranteed if we do what those who say we should not support Ukraine advocate. And they partly say that by saying, oh my God, nuclear war. Now, Russia is our peer nuclear rival, so we can't dismiss this possibility. And Putin is a very smart psychologist. That's what the KGB teaches you to do, to read people. I will be done in 90 seconds. So he has fed this notion that he is a rat in the corner who's going to lash out if you keep him in that corner, and lash out with nukes. Now, he has gotten a lot by this bluff. So it's a tried and true tactic as a bluff. If he would actually use nukes, the price he would pay would be extraordinary. So the chances of him doing so are tiny. But if he were to get away with the bluff in Ukraine, we will face that bluff in the Baltic states. If we let him win in the Baltic states, NATO is kaput, and that wonderful world order I described is kaput, and our security is truly endangered, and Americans will be fighting and dying in the Baltic states. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Andres, before we get into your heavy message, tell the people with whom you had lunch today and the name of your new book.
Is this turned on? Yes. You stole my thunder. So, I have a message for you. So, Rick Nelson told me to tell you that he wrote my speech for tonight. I had the honor to have lunch with him and Don, and it was a thrill. I mean, come on, a guy pulls up a photograph with him standing next to Jeff Beck and Stevie Ray Vaughan, and he's the third guy, and I am, you know, I'm in awe, and I didn't think I could make it tonight. So, first of all, Mr. President, thank you. Don and Frida, thank you for your friendship. We've been friends for a long time. Full disclosure, I was here 16 years ago, and I left with an LP from Cheap Tricks. And Christine, thank you very much for helping Christina for arranging this. What I want to do is, well, first of all, you will not be surprised that I'm totally in agreement with my friend and colleague, Ambassador Herbst. And I just want to start by saying that a few months before the Russian invasion, the ambassador and I were in Kiev. And I hadn't been back in Kiev for a very, very long time. What really surprised me was the energy, and everyone that I'd met on the street, the taxi driver, the servants, the housemaids, the professors, they all speak English. They all speak good English. They speak Western English. They speak a language which suggests they're part of us. They belong with us. So I just wanted to make this very clear statement that what we have a vested, and I'll move on to the energy part very quickly, but Ukraine, winning the war in Ukraine is in our national security interest, but it is also in the interest of the whole democratic thinking, free world. How did we get here? And for a couple of years, I was PNG'd from the, you know what PNG is. For those who don't know, it's persona non grata. You're not allowed to enter the country where you're PNG'd. So I was PNG'd from the German embassy for a couple of years. And probably by the time we end this event, I'll be PNG'd again, because I was one of the most staunch opponents of Nord Stream 2 and Nord Stream 1. And let's face it, without primarily German dependency on Russian energy, we would not have gotten where we are today. It's the equation is very, very simple. Germany, with its stubbornness, Germany with the idea that trade with the Russians will lead to a peaceful coexistence, was simply wrong. And no matter how much and how loud the Central Europeans, first and foremost, spoke up and said, this is dead wrong. You are running into a dead-end street from which you will not be able to get out except at a very, very high cost. They wouldn't listen. So I would say this is the number one cause of why we are here. Don't forget, Russian gas to Europe was flowing through Ukraine for a very, very long time. So the Russians, for their revenues, were very much dependent on the Ukrainians. If you want, this was a security guarantee to the Ukrainians. And once Germany took the big step and built out the Nord Stream 2 pipeline in the Baltic Sea, and then started building Nord Stream 2, which was going to be finished in a couple of months, except that the war broke out, this whole thing vanished. Mind you, I just want to remind all of you, I was in the room in Budapest when the leaders of the free world, including Russia, signed the so-called Budapest Agreement, the Budapest Memorandum on Ukraine, where these countries made a pledge to guarantee Ukraine's integrity as a country. And that pledge has been totally forgotten. Now, Nord Stream 2 is not the only mistake Europeans made. I think equally important is the fact that a couple of years ago, the Germans and we still don't know the exact reason why, Angela Merkel shut down the nuclear capacity or the nuclear plants in Germany, and we're going to shut down all of their plants this year, if it was not for the war, which means that the dependency on Russian supplies was growing by the year. Finally, I must say, and don't get me wrong, I think we do have a climate crisis. I do think that we need to deal with the climate issues. I do believe in the green transition, but I think it went way too fast, way too far, and I think the Europeans did not realize that there has to be a proper balance between energy security and green transition. My mantra in the last couple of years has been more energy security, not less green transition. More energy security, not less green transition. We need to, by the way, the first signals that something is going to go wrong was when the taxi drivers in Paris, the famous gilets jaunes or the yellow vests, started demonstrating because Macron raised the price of gas by 10 centimes or 10 cents, which was signaling the possibility that going too fast, we will run into trouble. And the fact is that the idea that renewables will take over and we can forget about the fossil fuels was just a misunderstanding. I want to, because we're running out of time and I think we want a conversation, I want to say that thank God for U.S. LNG and thank God for U.S. oil production, that the Europeans are not going to freeze to death this winter. If it were not for our LNG production, if it were not for the amount of gas that we can supply to Europe, I think they would be in such a deep trouble. There's a problem. They don't have the infrastructure. And other problem is that we in the United States have not been very smart And we have not built our own infrastructures to be able to supply more gas to our European allies. So I think this is something we should think about. You have to understand the German dependency on Russian gas was 55% before the war, 55%. Now it's down to 35%, but it's still terribly high. And there are countries in Europe whose dependency is even higher than that. Some of the Baltic countries are even in bigger trouble. So the message is, let's figure out how to help the Europeans. Two last comments. This winter will be difficult, but trust me, next year will be even more difficult. The reason being that, thank God for Xi Jinping's stupid COVID policy, the Chinese economy tanked, and they didn't need that much LNG, they didn't need that much oil, but that's not going to last forever. Once the Chinese economy picks up, the Europeans will be in trouble. There will be no LNG shipments turning around from the Pacific to Europe. Yes. Well, the supply chain disruption is well, that's more of a China problem. That's more of a China problem. The supply chain disruption is more of a China problem. The fact is that Russia, as John mentioned, Russia is a third world economy. Europe does not really, where Europe depends on Russia is purely and exclusively on energy, nothing else. So therefore, I would, in the context of the Ukraine crisis, I wouldn't want to exaggerate the supply chain issue, but I think we should discuss that at a later stage. But in conclusion, I'd like to say that at the end of the day, we're going to get out of this mess. And we're going to get out of this mess with U.S. leadership. There's a great saying, I shared it with some of you over dinner. There's a great saying, the Europeans hate American leadership, but they hate the lack of it even more. I'll stop here.
Well, good evening. It's a privilege to be here. Thanks, Congressman, for an invitation. Thank you, Rockford University and all the other sponsors. It's a privilege to be up here with these two distinguished colleagues. I'm going to make some comments tonight. I need to start out, just bear with me, Congressman, for a little bit of Nuclear 101 before I go too far, because I think there's a little bit of a history that must be highlighted before we talk about the risk of nuclear war in Ukraine. I'm going to tell you a sea story. I spent 26 years in the Navy, 16 years in sea duty. I'm going back now to 1977. I finished all my nuclear power training under the Rickover regime. Showed up on board USS George Bancroft, a ballistic missile submarine, had two crews, a blue and a gold crew. I'm told by the XO my first week, go to Osternorf, go to emergency action message training next week. I do that, get indoctrinated in what's called the Single Integrated Operational Plan, the Nuclear Warfighting Plan, SIOP. I do that. 2 months later, we fly over from Charleston, South Carolina, to Rota, Spain, get on board the submarine, go out on sea trials. I'm a junior officer deck. I'm not qualified anything. It's my first time on board the submarine. We're driving out of Rota, Spain. We get past a 3-mile nautical mile limit, which at that time was the law of the sea territorial limit. And as soon as we cross 3 miles, a Soviet AGI is the acronym for Soviet Intelligence Collection Vessel, comes on our starboard beam about 25, 30 yards away, parallels our course. We're on the surface. It's too shallow to submerge. And they lower a hydrophone into the water to record our propeller noise, take a bunch of movie camera pictures of us, trying to collect photo intelligence. And that's kind of harmless at one level. But then this AGI crosses our bow within 25 yards. Now, we're an 8,000-ton submarine carrying 16 Poseidon missiles, each of which has MIRV warheads. We're talking, and a nuclear reactor, of course. It was pretty dicey for a couple hours while this Soviet ship is harassing us in violation of the 1972 U.S.-USSR Instance at Sea Agreement. We send off an OPREP-3 Navy Blue message to the National Command Authority to report back to the Secretary of Defense we're being harassed at sea. And when we finished that, about 3 hours into the thing, we submerged because we're in deeper water in the Atlantic Ocean. I said, that's kind of exciting. That's my introduction to the Soviet harassment of U.S. Navy submarines, and that continued for many years. That was a very typical, not unusual scenario. But I saw it firsthand, it got my attention. We went on then, came back into port, loaded food, went back out for 75 days, submerged, staying underwater, 75 days, 24/7 communications, staying away from any other Soviet ships, ready to launch our nuclear missiles if needed, based on a presidential launch order. It was a pretty intense environment. This is the Cold War, mutual assured destruction. Soviets and the U.S. had thousands and thousands of missiles, warheads, and so forth. I went on after that submarine to serve on 5 other submarines, and 2 of those other submarines I carried tactical nuclear weapons. A tactical nuclear weapon is a weapon that's not covered by a U.S. Arms Control Treaty. So the ballistic missile submarine, the ICBMs, those are covered by the SALT Treaty or New START or the old Intermediate Nuclear Forces INF Treaty in Europe. Tactical nukes are not covered by treaties, typically of a smaller tactical yield than a large ballistic missile, submarine missile, or an ICBM. That was the environment I lived in for many years. And left the Navy later on, and after having captain of a ship and a squadron, went on Capitol Hill, and I got more involved in nuclear policy at that point in time, back in 2003, 2007, in the George W. Bush administration. I saw then the first was called the Nuclear Posture Review. And the Nuclear Posture Review is a document that basically establishes for each administration the administration's policy towards nuclear deterrence, assurance of our allies, specifically NATO allies, South Korea, Japan, et cetera. The first of those nuclear posture reviews was after the end of the Cold War during President Clinton's administration. Every president has done one since. And thankfully, my observation over many administrations was that these haven't changed very much. Last Thursday, the Biden administration issued their nuclear posture review. And it's pretty consistent with the Trump, Obama, et cetera, predecessor reviews. The good news there is that we've had a situation where we've had continuity of emphasizing the role of nuclear deterrence. If you look at the Secretary of Defense's webpage on the Pentagon website, you'll see that nuclear deterrence is the #1 mission of the Department of Defense, because that's an existential threat for us, right? So you want to make sure we're not under attack and so forth. The nuclear posture review is pretty detailed. I'm not going to go into the specifics, but with respect to the Ukraine conflict, it's important to note that it does provide assurance of our allies. Again, Ambassador Herbst has talked about this. It's our NATO allies. Ukraine's not a member of NATO, but it's a very real document. And I think the calculated ambiguity piece you were talking about from President Biden, I agree completely, John. It's helpful to send a strong message to President Putin that there may be dire consequences, or will be dire consequences, from any use of nuclear weapons by the Russian military in the Ukraine conflict. I'm skipping here several pages. I'm tightening up my presentation here on the go. Let me talk just for a minute about a pre-Ukraine scenario that was around in the Department of Defense, at least, and I think State Department. You can correct me if I'm wrong. You mentioned the Baltics earlier. Nuclear policy analysts were talking about in 2016, 17, 18, 19, an escalate to de-escalate strategy. It's a theory or concept whereby if Russia conducts a conventional military attack on one of the Baltic states, again, the Baltics are part of NATO, that it might be necessary for Russia to use one or more tactical nuclear weapons to seal victory, to bring this home, to cement the conventional military's aggressive actions, and to deter somebody else, could be the United States, could be NATO, from acting further. Lots of debate and discussion on this has continued for a long period of time before the Ukraine invasion by Russia back in February of this year. But I just add that this philosophy of a limited nuclear attack is conceptually and by analysts something that's considered very possible. I'm not going to say likely, but it's possible this could occur. And we need to be prepared to deal with that. And I think, quite frankly, my experience is that we are. Let's talk about NATO just for a few minutes. On October 13th, I'm going to read a quote here. NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg had a press conference following a meeting of NATO defense ministers, and he's discussing Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I'm going to read this direct quote from the Director General, Secretary General. Quote, President Putin's nuclear rhetoric is dangerous and irresponsible. We take these threats seriously and remain vigilant. We will not be intimidated. Any use of nuclear weapons would fundamentally change the nature of the conflict and have severe consequences. Russia knows that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. It raises questions. Some of these have already been introduced by my colleagues. What do we make, or what should we make, of President Putin's nuclear threats? Does Putin feel so strongly about bringing Ukraine back under, quote, the sphere of influence of the Russian Federation that he's willing to use one or more nuclear weapons to do so? We saw, starting October 8th, after the attack on the Crimean Bridge, massive retaliation by missiles launched by Russia against civilian targets in Kyiv. Is Putin willing to go further than those conventional attacks and use nuclear weapons as a response to reprisals? A lot of questions. I don't have any answers for you. What I am going to do is perhaps cite a few recent quotes in the press from people that have been looking at this for some period of time, and I think you might find some of these interesting. I rely upon the Wall Street Journal for a lot of my news. That's kind of my go-to source. Agree or disagree with that, that's fine. Peggy Noonan, April 30th of 2022, was asked why would Putin use tactical nuclear weapons, and was asked, then she asked the question, why would he make such a madman move? And her answer was to change the story, to shock and destabilize his adversaries, to scare the people of NATO countries so they'll force their leaders to back away, to remind the world and Russians that he does have military power, to avoid a massive and public military defeat, to win. Walter Russell Mead writes later in October of this year that Putin is waging, quote, a global war on the U.S.-led order. For Putin, the conquest of Ukraine is an essential step in preserving Russia's ability to carry out its historic mission to curb the ambitions of the Imperial West. I serve on the National Academy of Sciences Committee tasked by Congress to look at the methods for analyzing the risk of nuclear war. I was at U.S. Strategic Command in Omaha last week on this. One of my colleagues on that committee, Scott Sagan, published an article in the Wall Street Journal. It was a big 1.5-page article, October 15th. He was relying upon the Cuban Missile Crisis lessons that Ambassador Herbst talked about earlier in his remarks. Scott, who's a friend, said that there's 5 key lessons. I'm going to list just 2 of those lessons from the Cuban Missile Crisis that he thinks are applicable to the U.S. experience today in Ukraine. First is the need to avoid verbal threats that constitute a commitment trap on the part of either the United States or NATO. And again, going back to the point that Ambassador Herbst made, Scott says there is value in what Sagan characterizes as a strategy of calculated ambiguity. The second lesson highlights the importance of developing effective and realistic escalatory military options. We've already heard about the possibility to send other types of military aid and equipment to Ukraine. Having thought about this topic a bit, I'll offer just 3 personal observations. One, beware of the long-term consequences of weak action or no action. In my opinion, the Western response to the 2008 Russian invasion of Georgia, the red line and chemical weapons being used in Syria in 2012 with no effective response, the 2014 annexation by Putin of Crimea, and again, the poorly executed withdrawal from Afghanistan last summer come to mind. Second, NATO is very important, period. My colleagues have already highlighted that point. I'm in complete agreement. And third, a credible nuclear deterrent for the United States and NATO is absolutely critical. I've been part of that during my time in the uniform, and I think it's really an important national asset that we need to all pay attention to. Now, before I close, I'm going to talk very quickly and briefly about another topic that has the N word, nuclear word in it, and it's the nuclear facilities in Ukraine, Chernobyl and Zaporizhia. In 1986, we experienced the world's worst nuclear accident. Some of you may have seen the HBO series on Chernobyl. It came out a little over a year ago. In 1986, I was lieutenant commander, engineer officer on USS John Marshall, an attack submarine down in Norfolk, Virginia. We were taking portable air samples topside every day, starting in late April of 1986, and getting positive activity from this accident 5,000 miles away. 22 years later, I'm an official at the Department of Energy. I go visit the port of Antwerp, Belgium. This is in 2008. And I'm talking to the head of the Belgian Port Authority about the use of portal monitors to measure radiation in the containers, because most containers are screened for radiation before they go onto ships to come into the United States. And I asked this Belgian official what kind of detections of radiation had he had in the last year. He said he had a shipment of contaminated scrap metal from India that had cobalt-60, a radioactive isotope in it. The other one was a shipment of blueberries from Ukraine. And that was in 2008, 22 years after the accident. I go to Ukraine in 2015, go to Chernobyl, and give me a small radiation monitoring device, put it on my belt, and we're in a vehicle going very quickly by the reactor building, and we spent maybe less than 3 minutes within 200 feet of that building. That was in 2015. 29 years after the event. So I raise that because we know for a fact there's high levels of radiation in that facility. So we know that the Russians are not dumb people. They have good scientists. So to see these Russian soldiers digging trenches the first week of March of 2022 in the ground at Chernobyl is horrible. But it also reflects a tremendous breakdown in military discipline, military command and control. Last point, I'm going to shift down a little further south to Zaporizhia. I was heavily involved in the U.S. response to the reactor accident in Japan in 2011 in Fukushima. You need to have, we all know from the news, you need to have a constant source of cooling to remove decay heat from the reactor core in a nuclear power plant, whether it's operating at power or shut down. You also need cooling to remove the heat from spent fuel assemblies that are sitting in spent fuel swimming pools. So the off-site power at Zaporizhia has been compromised by Russian artillery strikes. Russian artillery strikes have damaged the power that goes into that plant. The plant manager was taken hostage for a period of time. The current workers at Zaporizhia, and there's 6 reactors there now, the current workers are under duress. I was in Atlanta for a nuclear conference just the last 2 days, so yesterday I was talking to an official at the World Association of Nuclear Operators, WANO, and this individual had been in discussions with Ukraine and International Atomic Energy Agency people the previous day. These are dire circumstances. This is new ground. We've not had this situation before with an armed conflict in the vicinity of operating nuclear plants. We need to pay attention to that. I'm going to stop right there. Thank you.
For those live streaming who want to ask a question, send an email to Catherine Forslund. It's CFORSLUND@rockford.edu. Questions? Well, go ahead.
Is this on? Before we move on, there is one aspect of the supply chain issue that I should have touched upon, and which is really related to the expertise, Bill's expertise. We have made ourselves, the West has made itself too much dependent on Russian fuels for nuclear plants. And I want to ask Bill to comment on that, because this is something that you have asked me to comment on. I should have mentioned this. This is an important issue. So go ahead, Bill.
About 30% of the nuclear fuel used in the United States commercial nuclear power plants comes from Russia. You probably didn't know that. We have a heavy dependency on Russian uranium supplies. We're talking about 3 to 5% enriched uranium-235 is the fuel that's used. I was on Capitol Hill on a private dinner with 5 members of Congress and nuclear industry back in April of this year to talk about this exact issue. The whole dinner is focused on uranium supplies. And you're exactly right, Ambassador. This is a huge dependency we need to get out of this. The bipartisan members of Congress there were very supportive of taking steps, including steps going as far as calling for an embargo. The current Defense Authorization Act, which has not been resolved through the final conference process between the House and Senate, has about $700 million in that bill, I think the House version, to encourage domestic production of what's called high-assay, low-enriched uranium that would be a domestic source of fuel, not only for existing nuclear power plants in the United States, but also for some of the advanced nuclear reactors that are under consideration by various vendors. Thanks for asking the question.
Catherine, do you have the mic? Okay. Who has the second question, because no one wants to be first? Over here. No, hang on, the mic's coming.
So I thought it was kind of interesting, the semantics, how you used to describe a possible nuclear attack on Ukraine, because whenever you mention a nuclear attack, you said Putin will not launch a nuclear attack, or you're confident that he won't. But when we're talking about a possible successor to Putin, that's a whole different story. And I understand that a possible successor to Putin could be somebody who is more extreme than him.
That is completely speculative, completely. And we can't rule it out. But to the extent we have evidence from carefully monitoring what we can monitor, which is incomplete, the chances of that are not likely, and I'll explain why. We have seen on the public record that the man most eager to conquer Ukraine, despite the substantial strategic damage the invasion poses for Russia, is Putin himself. I'm sure you saw at least part of that very strange video of Putin meeting with his national security team 3 days before the invasion. Those were the guys who are the quote-unquote siloviki, the men of power. They control the various, the apparatus of repression, the intelligence services, the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Defense. Everyone on that video was looking glum as Putin outlined his intention. In a word, they were not happy campers. If you need further evidence of this, look at the video that appeared 3 days after the invasion. Putin was meeting with his top general, Gerasimov, his Minister of Defense, Shoigu, and he announced Russia was raising its nuclear alert. This is part of the Putin nuclear bluff against the West. Shoigu and Gerasimov were not smiling. Finally, for about 8 days, 9 days after the big Russian invasion, there was substantial unhappiness in Russia with the invasion that was publicly evident. The biggest piece, of course, which we all saw, were demonstrations across Russia of literally hundreds of thousands of Russian, but more important for this purpose was statements being made by major financial figures, and even more important were private messages coming to American think tankers, and some public evidence of this coming from Russian think tankers, who are all kind of in the Kremlin orbit, just expressing their uneasiness with the invasion. Now, about 10 days after the invasion, the hammer came down. Tens of thousands of Russians were arrested, those demonstrating. And suddenly, like one unit, the think tankers began to talk in very aggressive terms about how Russia was going to conquer Ukraine and were going to go after the West big time. So only when the career consequences of frank conversation among the think tankers, the guys who believe in Russia, the great power, did they echo the Kremlin line. Last point. Last point. Again, we don't know how things will play out in Russia. We do know that historically, when Russia has begun a splendid little war, which turns out badly, the country moves, at least for a time, in a more liberal direction. So, again, we can't predict the outcome, but the evidence suggests less than the Neanderthal and more an accommodationist. And most of the people who talk about the Neanderthal alternative have been echoing Kremlin talking points. And folks in my community, some real experts on Russia who are on the wrong side of this, they accept the historical version that Ukraine sort of belongs to Russia, even though the Ukrainian people have shown by their bravery and their ingenuity as fighters that Ukraine most definitely does not belong to Russia. And I think as Americans, that should strike a chord of sympathy beyond the interest we have in making sure that Putin is shut down in Ukraine.
That was an excellent question. Thank you. Next question. Raise your hand so Catherine can see you.
I think you've all alluded to the fact that the Soviet Union has nuclear weapons and is capable of a nuclear war. And your understanding today, and I also understand that the modern nuclear weapon is about 1,000 times more potent than what we dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. In your understanding, how many nuclear weapons capable of hitting the United States does Russia have today? And how many of those, if well placed, would essentially destroy the United States? And I assume that the United States has the same number that would go back the other way to Russia.
Let me take a stab at that, and others may want to chime in. Under the New START Treaty, which came into place in 2010 under President Obama and was extended here in the first year of President Biden's presidency, the United States and Russia are each limited to 1,550 strategic nuclear weapons. Those are referring to weapons that are in ICBMs, or intercontinental ballistic missiles, or submarine launched. We also, the United States has tactical nuclear weapons, the B-61-12, which is dropped by bombers. Those numbers are classified, how many we have. Russians are speculated to have between 1,000 and 2,000 tactical weapons, nuclear weapons, which is more than we have. I'll just say that at the unclassified level. One thing to your point about yield that I'll bring up is interesting. I was trying to cut out some of my remarks to save some time. One thing I cut out was the fact that in 2019, the Trump administration reduced, the submarine-launched ballistic missile warhead W-76-1 by creating the W-76-2, a much lower yield weapon, less than 10 kilotons. So it was significantly reduced in yield to provide the ability of the United States, if needed, remember that escalate to de-escalate scenario I talked about in the Baltics? So if Putin and Russia used a tactical nuclear weapon in that theater, then we would have a comparable sized weapon to provide a proportional response. A proportional response is required under the law of armed conflict. So we've gone, now we have an option to use a much lower yield weapon than we did not have 4 years ago in that kind of a scenario. So I wanted to kind of dispel the rumor that we only have these huge megaton weapons. That's not the case. We have smaller weapons today. Remember seeing the Beirut port explosion 2 years ago, 2020? The force of the explosion was equal to 0.3 kilotons. That destroyed that entire waterfront. 0.3 kilotons, the weapon, Nagasaki, around 15 kilotons. About 45 times that explosion. Just for comparison purposes.
There's another point that's important here about the political side of this. The weapons that the Soviet Union had during the Cuban Missile Crisis were massively larger than the bombs we dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So in a sense, we faced a similar danger then from an enemy that was far more powerful overall than the enemy that Putin represents today. And my point was we were able to defend our vital interest despite that. And it seems to me, with the right policy, we can do the same today. Again, this is not risk-free, but again, if we cave on Ukraine because of Putin's nuclear threats, we will face similar threats elsewhere, not just from Russia, but from China, North Korea, and maybe eventually even Iran.
Yeah, well, let me add something, and it's indirectly related to this conversation. I did not say almost anything about the European Union reacted pretty solidly and robustly to the crisis. I mean, it goes to their credit. And I criticized the Germans. I want to make sure I'm let into the German embassy after this meeting. So I want to say that the Europeans are really cutting into the Russian economy. So what is happening is that before the crisis, 55% of German gas came from Russia. It's down to 30% now. The overall consumption by the Europeans was 41%. Now it's down to 17%. What I'm trying to say is, and by December 5th, the oil embargo will kick in for oil transported in vessels, right? Not the pipelines, because that some countries need to keep the oil flowing, some smaller countries. But in February, the gasoline products will be totally banned. So what I'm trying to say is that Putin's problems, economic problems, will start growing exponentially by the beginning of next year, and you will see that. Putin's calculation is that the solidarity of Americans and the solidarity of the Europeans and the integrity of the transatlantic relationship and the integrity of the Europeans is going to collapse. I think they're wrong. I think they're underestimating democracies. I think they're underestimating the sentiment in the West. So I think he's making a miscalculation there. But his biggest problem will be economic. And therefore, it would be a stupid, and I'm almost certain some of his generals have talked to him and said, hey, Vladimir, don't fool around with this. This is not going to work. Because the last couple of days, he has been making statements to the country. He's made statements that, no, Russia will not use nuclear weapons. So what I want to say in response to this, don't exaggerate the nuclear threat, because that's exactly what he wants. He wants the public to be scared and the public to push our governments into pulling back on what we're doing now.
Next question.
I have a question from the live stream audience. What has prevented Ukrainian forces from attacking Russian territory using special or covert operations against Russian strategic targets?
First, we are advising them to avoid that. And we've often explained our unwillingness to give certain weapon systems, including the ATACMS that I've already referred to, because they would allow Ukraine to strike Russian territory. Although it's also true, given how close they are because of their successful counteroffensive to the Russian border, they can attack with the equipment they have, but obviously with a much more limited range. It is true, though, that Ukraine has struck at the Russian border town of Belgorod, which is a major logistical staging point for weapons and fuel. And my understanding, this is, I lost my security clearance because I retired from the State Department in 2010, so this is not classified information. My understanding is we have not been so enthusiastic about that, although I don't think we have publicly chastised them for it. And there's a story in the Ukrainian media I read just today that the Ukrainians conducted a special forces operation, and by the way, their special forces are very good, we train them well, on a Russian military base near the Baltic states and destroyed some helicopters. And that takes lots of guts and lots of talents to pull off. I personally don't think that's the best use of Ukrainian resources. They should finish off the Kerch Bridge with that excess energy, although the Kerch Bridge is right now not operable, but it could be operable if they don't take further steps. But this is a factor.
Thank you.
There's a question over here, right here, and then over there.
I think you've already somewhat answered my question on the economic impact. What I'm trying to understand is that obviously we see the lives of the average person in Ukraine extremely affected by this. We see the lives of people in Europe, for example, Germany with the shortage of energy, and throughout the world, food supplies, etc. And I'm sympathetic to the Russian people themselves, but not this military attack. And I'm much more sympathetic and have a great love for Ukraine, so don't think that I'm. So my question is, at what point will we see the Russian people themselves being impacted by the economic downfall as you've described, which I kind of see that's the game that's going. So at what point are we going to see the Russian people impacted as we're seeing other people impacted?
Well, I have, so the issue is that most Russians kind of say, well, it was terrible under the Tsar, it was terrible under Lenin, and it was terrible under Stalin, it was terrible under Brezhnev, what's new? And I've always suggested that the resilience of, it's not resilience, it's the tolerance of Russians is much higher. The threshold of pain in Russia is much higher because they're used to it. Where I do see a huge difference, and this is why I need to praise the Ukrainians again. Ukraine is a different society. It's a European society, well, with a strong impact from the East, but it is a European society. It's better organized. Don't underestimate the ability. The Ukrainians are going to suffer, but they kind of know why they are suffering. They are ready to sacrifice a lot in order to save their country, their identity, which has been suppressed and stolen for them for centuries. And so, therefore, I'd say that I cannot, so don't compare the two, definitely don't compare the two societies. And I repeat again, Putin's calculation is that our societies will not survive or will not be able to cope with the impact of the energy shortages, the economic downturn, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of Russia, you know, we're all students of Russia. It all depends. Russia, if there is change in Russia, that will not depend on the people. It will depend on the elite. And that is the critical issue. And in my view, we, the United States and the West, has not done enough to communicate early with the Russian elites, the Russian political elite, the Russian cultural elite, and definitely the Russian scientific elite, which, by the way, during the Cold War was a very, very important part of our foreign policy. That we have not done. The question is, can we speed it up? Can we reinvent ourselves in terms of communication, the thing we used to call soft power? That's the big issue. Only that will start a movement, a movement towards change in Russia. That's my analysis.
Just a quick response. Isn't it all a money game, though? I mean, if the money doesn't continue to come by the sale of their energy products, don't these elites have a different opinion?
So the elites, the problem really is that the elites are you know, they've got a gun to their head. And when you have a gun to your head, you don't react rationally to your money being taken away. What Putin is telling the elite is that I gave you the money, I can take it back anytime. No one's safe. And the reason why, surprise, surprise, people are falling out of buildings is a message. It's like the horse's head in The Godfather, right? I'm sending you a message, and you'd better just, you know where your place is. If they lose a couple of billions, that's their problem. Putin doesn't care. You don't have an elite that is going to revolt, that is going to rise up. So that's why I'm thinking about the much broader elite. I'm thinking about as I said, the cultural, the scientific elite, which will definitely make a difference. But to count on the oligarchs to rise up against Putin, that will not happen.
Next question.
Hi.
Go ahead.
The overall question I have is, what can we in Rockford do to help? And I've been thinking about this for many months, and I have 3 ideas that I'd like to share. The first is I'd like to reach Common and John Legend, who created a song that ends the movie Selma. And if they would add 2 stanzas to that, glorifying Ukraine. Ukraine has a major song called Glory, and the theme within that song is glory. If they were to do that and share that with Ukraine, that might inspire the people of Ukraine even more. Second idea is the AR-15 idea. We're so upset that so many civilians have a weapon of war, the AR-15. If we could persuade people, even if it's just a few, to donate their AR-15s by giving them to the local law enforcement, which would then send it to the State Department and send it to Ukraine, and give it to the Ukrainian civilians, then any place that's under control of Russia, all the people there would be terrified of being killed by Ukrainians. And the third idea is this. A couple of Russians escaped from Russia to Alaska recently. They took a boat. And that reminded me of Seward's Folly. So if somehow eventually when things wind down, we talk about negotiating something, maybe Russia could be persuaded to buy Crimea the way we bought Alaska and pay a whole lot of money to Ukraine, and they would get it, but they wouldn't have stolen it, they would have bought it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the comment. Next question.
Thank you for your insight tonight. It's been incredible. One of the big questions that I have, over the last year and a half, we've imposed a number of sanctions on Russia as well as our European counterparts. We know China is somewhat of a foe, as well as Iran, that we know that they're helping Russia. But the one country that I scratch my head about is India. You know, we are their largest trading partner. They're our 7th largest trading partner. And I don't know if we've done enough to cut off them continuing to buy arms from Russia when we're such an important trading partner to them. So I'd like to hear your insight on that.
I think that there are, roughly speaking, 3 reasons why India has been relatively supportive of Russia in this war. I say relatively because they have not endorsed the Russian war. They've not voted in favor of what Russia has done. The first reason is essentially New Delhi and Moscow have been allies for 65, 70 years. I mean, India in theory was a principal player in the non-aligned movement during the Cold War, but Russia always backed India against Pakistan, and then later when Russia and China were at loggerheads against China, and that assistance, that support was most importantly in arms control, arms supplies, when we were not sending India much in the way of arms supplies. So there's an historic relationship. The second reason is that we don't play tough. When the Russians are quote unquote crossed, they punch hard. When we're crossed, we go like this. And this was true. I mean, Andras was no more popular in the German embassy than I was on the Nord Stream 2 issue. And I was equally unpopular at the NSC, our NSC, that while it understood the importance of consulting with our allies, which Trump did not understand, it did not understand that American leadership requires not just consultation, but doing what a good whip does in the Congress, which is whipping our partners into line when they're heading in the wrong direction, which is why we let Germany pursue policy on gas which contradicted not just European interests, but American interests. And what we did with Germany, we do with India. So there's no price. And the third, which is kind of an offset of the second, but brings us to the present, is that India is getting cut-right prices for oil from Russia because of the oil cap policy which we're putting on, which is a good policy. But of course, if India were playing along with us, the consequences for Moscow would be more severe. So this is what we've got. In terms of mistakes by the administration, this is up there, but it's not at the top.
This could change, and something you need to keep in mind that we're gaining an incredible amount of experience with this war in terms of military hardware, how it works, and I will bet you that the Indians have started thinking, hey, wait a minute, we've been buying this scrap material, scrap metal for a long time, and what if there is a real conflict with China? Will it work? And this is going to be a serious consideration. So your question, and I totally agree with John that yeah, sometimes I mean, come on, I mean, we should be tougher. Some tough love to some of the allies would be good. So I just want you to keep this little aspect in mind.
So I have to exert some tough love here and bringing our program to an end. Let me just say my thanks to Dr. Forstmann. She's an expert in U.S. diplomatic history. The strength of the History and International Relations Department here at Rockford University is extraordinary. And Professor Ron Lee is here. He's the head of the Department of Political Science, Sociology, and Criminal Justice. And I've had the opportunity as an adjunct instructor, and my pay doubles every year, doesn't it? You triple it, yeah, the 0 times 0 times 0. But what I have found here at Rockford University is the extraordinary depth of these professors and the jewel that this university provides to Northern Illinois and the areas all around us. And I spend a lot of time working on these programs and co-teaching, bringing in, helping to bring in extraordinary people such as we've had tonight because of the commitment that I have to Rockford University to make this school even a brighter beacon than it is now in showing to the community at large that this school is not just for the students, but for everybody, including people around the country that have been live streaming the program. Well, let's thank our presenters tonight for an extraordinary program. Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for coming, and please friends, chat with our panelists. Thank you.